Hi, boys and girls. This is Grandma Sheilla with your story today. The story is called Jim's Examination. Now, Jim was going to school in a large university, and he was studying to be an engineer. It takes a lot of work to be an engineer, so he had been working hard. Well, in a couple days, he was going to have to write his final examination. He had been studying and studying and studying, and he'd studied every day during the time he had been there. But this one was especially special. This was the final exam. He had worked exceptionally hard. And one of his friends came up to him and he said, "Jim, how you doing?" Jim said, "I'm fine. I'm just working really hard to learn all this stuff for the engineering program." And his friend said, "Jim, haven't you heard?" And he kind of looked around. He said, "There's a way to get the answers to the exam. There's a way to get the questions to the exam, and all you have to do is look up the answers and memorize them. Then when it's time to take the exam, you just write in the answers. It won't be hard at all. And a lot of the kids here are doing it." And Jim said, "How did they get the questions? Who gave them to him?" And he said, "Well, I really shouldn't be telling you much, but you can buy a set of the questions for $5, and I can get one for you if you want it." Jim, that was a real temptation, but his conscience was telling him that would not be right. So then the guy went on and he said, "Well, the janitor that goes in and cleans every night in the offices, he found a piece of carbon paper. In those days, they didn't have computers. They just had typewriters. And they would put one clean sheet of paper here, put the copy paper there, and put another one on the other side. And it would make the letters on that copy paper, which would be on the next paper. Well, they didn't find the paper that the questions for the exam were written on, but he found that carbon paper. And if he held it up in front of a mirror, he could read exactly what it said, and then he'd written the questions out." Well, Jim said, "No thanks. I want to be honest, and that wouldn't be honest." Well, the other guy looked at him and he said, "Why do you have to be so particular? This would be easy." Jim said, "It may be easy, but it's not right." So Jim went back to the rooming house where he was living, and he went to his landlord and he said, I'm going to be gone for a couple days. I want to study for my exams where it's quiet and people don't know where I am." And she said, "Okay." He said, "I'll be back the morning of the exam." So the story doesn't tell where Jim went, but he went somewhere. He found a room, and nobody knew where he was, so he could study. And he studied, and he studied, and he studied. On the morning of the exam, he went to the front of that big building where the engineering department was at the university, and he started climbing up the steps. And he felt good about it. He had worked hard, and he thought he knew what he needed to know. Well, when he got up in the hall, when they were going to have examinations, the professor would lock the door from the inside to the classroom, and they had to wait till the professor opened the door and said they could come in. Well, it was only like a minute before the professor opened the door, and he looked extremely stern that day, and like something was really wrong. The students all went in and sat in their seats. The ones that had studied hard were pleased with what they had done. The ones that hadn't studied were gloating that they were going to get a perfect score. They were saying this inside their head to themselves. But when they all sat down, they looked at the professor and they waited quietly. And the professor said, "Last night we discovered a very disturbing piece of information. We have found that the exam tests have been tampered with, that someone's copying them and selling them for money." So, several of the professors in this department got together and were up all night last night writing you a brand new exam. And you should have seen the look on the people who had bought the other questions' face. Their faces went pale. Some of them got really red because they knew they had been found out. Well, the professor passed out the exams. They were always put upside down, and you couldn't touch them till he said you could write. So the professor walked from place to place doing that. And then he said, "All right, you may all start this new exam." Well, there were some of them. They hadn't studied much at all, except for the answers for those other questions. And they got up and walked out of the classroom without even trying to take the exam. Some of them tried for a little while, but didn't know what they were doing, and they left. Well, there was quite a few still left in that room, and Jim was one of them. And they were frantically writing that test to get it all done before time was up. Well, when Jim was done, he walked out of the classroom pleased that he hadn't been dishonest, or he hadn't been unfair to anyone. And he was pleased that he felt that he had acted like a man should. And when his friend had talked to him about getting those questions for that exam, this is what he had thought. I'm going to study, and if I take the exam and I don't do well, I know it was my fault. And if I had taken those exam papers that the kids were selling, he would have felt ashamed of himself, and he wouldn't have been an honest and true man. And that's what I want all of you to do. Remember, listen to your conscience. Be honest. Do what you know to do. Thank you, boys and girls, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye now.